The Napa Valley sky wept a fine, chilling mist, mirroring the icy dread that had settled in Isabelle Izzy Moreau's bones. She stood on the hallowed ground of Moreau Vineyards, the sprawling estate her grandfather, Henri Moreau, had carved out of sun-drenched earth and sheer grit. Today, that earth felt less like fertile soil and more like the cold, unyielding clay of a grave. Henri's funeral was a somber affair, a gathering of hushed whispers and tear-streaked faces against the backdrop of rolling vineyards, now shrouded in a melancholic gray. Family and close friends huddled together in the small stone chapel nestled amongst the vines, the scent of incense and damp earth heavy in the air. Izzy watched her mother, Elise, Henri's only child, her face a mask of stoic grief, clutching a lace handkerchief as if it were a lifeline. Her father, a man of granite composure, stood beside Elise, his shoulders bowed with a weight Izzy had rarely witnessed. Even her usually boisterous cousins were subdued, their laughter so often echoing through the vineyard during summer harvests, now silenced by the gaping absence of its patriarch. But then there was Jean-Luc, Izzy's older brother. Even in the solemnity of the chapel, Jean-Luc emanated a discordant note. He stood a little apart, his gaze sweeping over the assembled mourners, a peculiar glint in his eyes that Izzy couldn't quite decipher. It wasn't grief. It was something else. Something unsettlingly expectant. As the service concluded and the mourners began to file out into the mist-laden air, Jean-Luc made his move. He clapped his hands together, the sharp sound cutting through the quiet murmur of condolences, like a gavel announcing the start of a grim auction. "Well," he declared, his voice booming louder than necessary, "with grandfather gone, I suppose everything naturally falls to me." A collective silence descended, heavier than the mist. Izzy turned, her brow furrowed, searching Jean-Luc's face for any hint of jest, any glimmer of irony to soften the crass pronouncement. But there was none. His expression was one of smug self-assurance, a look she knew all too well. A look that usually preceded some act of self-serving entitlement. Elise, her eyes still red-rimmed, blinked at her son, confusion warring with nascent anger. "Jean-Luc, what are you talking about?" Jean-Luc sighed dramatically, as if burdened by their collective obtuseness. "Grandfather's estate, maman. The vineyard, the winery, the house, the bank accounts, it's all mine now. As the eldest son. That's how these things work." He punctuated his statement with a dismissive wave of his hand, as if centuries of legal precedent were mere trifles to be brushed aside by his birth order. A nervous laugh escaped one of Izzy's younger cousins, a sound quickly stifled as the sheer audacity of Jean-Luc's claim sunk in. It wasn't a joke. He was serious. He had been waiting for this moment, for the final curtain to fall on Henri's life, so he could step into the spotlight of inheritance. Elise shook her head, her grief momentarily eclipsed by a surge of disbelief. "That's not how it works, Jean-Luc. There's a will." Jean-Luc shrugged, a gesture of careless indifference. "Sure, there's a will. But grandfather always told me everything would stay in the family. And I'm the one who's been managing the vineyard for the past few years. It only makes sense." He puffed out his chest slightly, preening under the weight of his self-proclaimed responsibility. Izzy's fists clenched, her nails digging into her palms. "Managing," she echoed, the word laced with thinly veiled sarcasm. To call Jean-Luc's involvement managing was a gross exaggeration. He had dabbled, certainly. He had flitted around the edges of the vineyard operations, offering unsolicited and often misguided advice, mostly when it suited his own whims. His real contribution had been in leveraging grandfather's generosity as his personal ATM, siphoning funds for ill-conceived ventures and extravagant indulgences. Whenever Henri had dared to question his spending or suggest a modicum of accountability, Jean-Luc would throw a tantrum worthy of a spoiled child, storm off in a huff, only to reappear, contrite and charming, when his coffers ran dry again. So you think grandfather just left everything to you? Just like that? Izzy challenged, her voice tight with suppressed anger. Jean-Luc smirked, a flash of predatory satisfaction. It's called primogeniture, Izzy. Firstborn son. It's tradition. It's how things should be done. Before Izzy could unleash the scathing retort simmering on her tongue, a calm, measured voice cut through the charged atmosphere. Actually, Mr. Davies, the family lawyer announced, stepping forward. That's not entirely accurate. All heads swiveled towards the lawyer, who had been standing quietly at the periphery of the group, a silent observer of the unfolding drama. Mr. Davies was a man carved from old oak and legal precedent, his face etched with the wisdom and weariness of countless estate battles. He exuded an air of quiet authority, a sense that he held the definitive answer in the unfolding saga. And right now, a flicker of something akin to amusement danced in his eyes, as if he anticipated the impending unraveling of Jean-Luc's carefully constructed delusion. Jean-Luc frowned, his smugness momentarily faltering. What's that supposed to mean, Mr. Davies? Mr. Davies adjusted his spectacles, cleared his throat, and drew a thick, cream-colored envelope from his worn leather briefcase. Your grandfather, he began, his voice resonating with legal gravitas, left a very specific will. And it meticulously outlines exactly how his estate will be divided. Jean-Luc crossed his arms, his initial confidence returning, bolstered by a renewed wave of entitlement. Great. Let's hear it then. I already know what it says. The lawyer offered him a small, enigmatic smile, a hint of something knowing and slightly pitying. I don't think you do, Mr. Moreau. He deftly opened the envelope, the crisp rustle of legal documents filling the expectant silence. He began to read, his voice steady and unwavering, laying bare the intricate tapestry of Henri Moreau's final wishes. As expected, Elise, Henri's daughter, received a generous share, a testament to the enduring love between father and daughter. Provisions were also made for the grandchildren, smaller but significant portions carved out for their future. But the lion's share of the estate, Moreau Vineyards, the winery, the sprawling family home nestled amongst the vines, and the bulk of Henri's considerable savings, was to be divided equally between Elise and Isabelle. Jean-Luc's smug grin began to erode, replaced by a creeping pallor. What? He snapped, his voice sharp with disbelief. That doesn't make sense. That's not how grandfather would have done it. The carefully constructed facade of entitlement was crumbling, revealing the raw, ugly greed beneath. Oh, but there's more, Mr. Davies continued, his voice laced with a subtle, almost imperceptible relish, as he flipped through the pages of the will. Your father did leave you something special, Mr. Moreau. Something quite unique. Jean-Luc straightened up, a flicker of his earlier arrogance returning, as if this special something would somehow validate his inflated sense of worth. Of course he did, he declared, a note of vindication creeping into his voice. He wouldn't just cut me out completely. Mr. Davies handed him a separate, smaller envelope, its stark white contrasting with the cream-colored legal documents. He wrote this specifically for you, Mr. Moreau. Jean-Luc snatched the envelope, his fingers trembling with a mixture of anticipation and a dawning unease. He ripped it open with uncharacteristic haste and began to read, his eyes darting across the page. As he devoured the words, his expression underwent a grotesque transformation. Confidence morphed into confusion. Confusion curdled into disbelief, and disbelief exploded into pure, unadulterated rage. He looked up, his face contorted, blood rushing to his cheeks, staining them a furious crimson. This is a joke, he roared, his voice cracking with fury. Mr. Davies shook his head, his composure unruffled. Your father was very clear in his wishes, Mr. Moreau. And I assure you, there is nothing remotely humorous about this. Izzy stepped closer, drawn by an irresistible morbid curiosity. Peering over Jean-Luc's shoulder at the offending letter. And that's when she saw it. Grandfather's final words to Jean-Luc, penned in his unmistakable, firm handwriting. The words were stark, brutal, and utterly devastating in their simplicity. Jean-Luc. Since you always believed you were entitled to everything, I've decided to grant you exactly what you deserve. You get the family legacy you've worked so hard for. Congratulations. You are now the sole owner of grandfather's old, gnarled mother vine in Block 7. Enjoy. Silence descended, broken only by Jean-Luc's ragged breathing. His hands trembled. The letter crinkling in his white-knuckled grip. His mouth opened and closed. Soundlessly, like a fish gasping for air. This isn't fair, he finally choked out. The words laced with a wounded petulance that was almost comical in its absurdity. Elise, her initial shock giving way to a grim satisfaction, let out a short, sharp laugh. Devoid of mirth. Oh, Jean-Luc, she said, her voice laced with ice. I think it's perfectly fair. And just like that, Jean-Luc, the golden boy, the entitled heir. The man who had always believed he was destined to inherit everything by virtue of his birthright, realized, with gut-wrenching finality, that he had lost. Utterly and completely. But the drama, Izzy knew, was far from over. Jean-Luc was not a man to accept defeat gracefully. And what happened next confirmed her darkest premonitions. That was when things spiraled from bad to catastrophically worse. Jean-Luc stood there, frozen, the letter clutched so tightly his knuckles gleamed white against the crimson flush of his face. The color drained from his cheeks, leaving him pale and trembling. His eyes darted wildly between Mr. Davies and Elise, as if searching for a lifeline, a sign that this was all some elaborate, cruel prank. This can't be real, he muttered, the words barely audible. A desperate plea to a universe that had just brutally rejected him. Grandfather wouldn't do this to me. The entitlement, even in the face of utter humiliation, clung to him like a second skin. Oh, it's real, Mr. Moreau, Mr. Davies stated calmly, his voice devoid of sympathy. He began to gather the scattered documents, his movements precise and efficient. Your father was very clear about his wishes. And to be frank, he added, his gaze meeting Jean-Luc's with unwavering directness, he made them legally airtight. There's no loophole, no hidden clauses. You get the mother vine, the family vineyard, the house. The money, everything else, belonged to your mother and Isabelle. Jean-Luc had spent years, decades even, basking in the imagined glory of his future inheritance, picturing himself as the Lord of Moreau Vineyards, the benevolent dictator of the family empire. And now, in front of everyone, his carefully constructed fantasy was dissolving into dust, leaving him with nothing but an old, gnarled mother vine in Block 7. Izzy could almost see the frantic gears turning in his head, desperation and rage warring for control. Jean-Luc wasn't just greedy, he was recklessly, dangerously so. He had squandered his own inheritance years ago, chasing fleeting fortunes and indulging in extravagant lifestyles he couldn't afford. He was drowning in debt, propped up only by grandfather's occasional, grudging bailouts. He had been counting on this inheritance, on Henri's fortune, to pull him from the abyss. And now, in a single, devastating moment, his entire future was imploding. Then, like clockwork, the explosion came. This is bullshit. Jean-Luc roared, the carefully constructed veneer of civility shattering into a million pieces. He hurled the letter to the ground, the flimsy paper fluttering down like a surrender flag. This isn't right. You. He turned on Elise, his finger jabbing towards her, trembling with fury. You did this. You turned grandfather against me. Elise scoffed, crossing her arms, her grief hardening into righteous anger. You did that all by yourself, Jean-Luc. Her voice was low, dangerous. Jean-Luc's gaze snapped back to Mr. Davies, his eyes narrowed slits of venomous rage. This isn't over, he hissed, his voice thick with menace. I'll fight it. I'll get a lawyer. Hell, I'll get the best lawyer in the state. There's no way my father meant for this to happen. Mr. Davies simply gave him a patient, almost pitying smile. As if he had anticipated this exact reaction, had factored it into his calculations long ago. By all means, Mr. Moreau, he said calmly. Feel free to contest the will. Just know that your father left additional instructions, should that happen. Jean-Luc froze, the blood draining from his face once more, leaving him ashen. What? He whispered, the bravado evaporating, replaced by a chilling premonition. What kind of instructions? Mr. Davies flipped through his papers again, extracting another, smaller document. Your father made it clear, he read, his voice devoid of inflection, that if you attempted to contest his will, he had an alternate arrangement prepared. One that would result in you receiving nothing. Not even the mother vine. Jean-Luc's mouth fell open, his carefully constructed world collapsing around him. That mother vine, Mr. Davies continued, his voice firm, is the last thing tying you to this family's legacy, Jean-Luc. If you contest the will, you won't even get that. It was like watching a man realize, in agonizing slow motion, that he was standing on the edge of a precipice, with nowhere left to fall but into the abyss. Jean-Luc had always prided himself on his cunning, his ability to manipulate and bully his way into getting whatever he wanted. But grandfather, even from beyond the grave, had outplayed him, had anticipated his every move, had laid a trap so perfectly constructed, so inescapable, that Jean-Luc was utterly ensnared. The rest of them just stood there, watching, waiting. This was Jean-Luc's moment of truth. He could take the mother vine, accept the devastating loss, and attempt to salvage what little remained of his life. Or he could do exactly what they all expected him to do, lash out, destroy, and ultimately, self-destruct. He chose the latter. This isn't over, he spat, shoving past Izzy with a force that sent her stumbling back. You'll regret this. Every single one of you. And with that final, impotent threat, he stormed off, abandoning the funeral, leaving a trail of simmering resentment and shattered expectations in his wake. The aftermath of Jean-Luc's volcanic eruption was a strange, unsettling quiet. He vanished, retreating into the shadows, presumably licking his wounds and plotting his next move. The rest of the family, still reeling from the emotional maelstrom, focused on honoring grandfather's memory, settling his affairs, and attempting to navigate the complexities of inheriting Moreau Vineyards. For a while, a fragile semblance of normalcy returned. The vineyard, though shrouded in grief, continued to breathe, the vines stretching towards the hesitant sunlight, indifferent to the human dramas unfolding around them. Izzy threw herself into the work, finding a strange solace in the familiar rhythms of the vineyard, the earthy scent of the soil, the meticulous pruning of the vines, the quiet hum of the winery. But then, about a month after the funeral, things started to get weird. First, there were the strange phone calls to the house. Cryptic messages left on the answering machine, hang-ups in the dead of night. Then, unsettling whispers started circulating amongst the vineyard workers. Rumors of Jean-Luc lurking around the property after dark, his presence an unwelcome shadow in the twilight. One evening, as Izzy drove past the winery's storage shed, a prickle of unease ran down her spine. Something felt off. She pulled over, her headlights illuminating the heavy wooden doors of the shed. The lock was broken, the thick metal hasp twisted and mangled. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through her. She cautiously pushed open the doors, her heart pounding in her chest. Nothing appeared to be stolen, but the air hung heavy with the acrid smell of gasoline. Izzy's blood ran cold. This wasn't random vandalism. This was deliberate. This was a message. And she knew, with chilling certainty, who had sent it. Then, the fire happened. It was late, close to midnight, the valley cloaked in inky darkness. when Elise's phone shrieked, shattering the fragile peace of the night. Izzy was staying with her mother at the family home, seeking mutual solace in their shared grief, so she heard everything. "Hello?" Elise answered, her voice thick with sleep. Silence. Then, a gruff, distorted voice, barely a whisper, rasped through the receiver. "Check the winery." The line went dead. Izzy sat bolt upright in bed, her senses instantly on high alert. "Who was that?" she demanded, her voice tight with apprehension. Elise stared at her, her face pale, her eyes wide with a dawning horror. I don't know," she stammered, her voice trembling. But, something felt terribly wrong. Without another word, Izzy grabbed her keys. They didn't even speak, didn't need to. A shared, unspoken fear propelled them out of the house and into the night. They drove in tense silence, the headlights cutting through the darkness. The mist now thickened into a dense fog, clinging to the vineyards like a shroud. They didn't even need to reach the winery to know something was terribly, irrevocably wrong. Halfway down the long, winding drive, through the rows of sleeping vines, they saw it. A flickering, orange glow painting the fog-laden sky in a macabre, dancing light. Flames. In the distance. At the winery. Izzy's heart stopped. Her breath hitched in her throat. By the time they screeched to a halt in front of the winery, the fire department was already there, sirens wailing. Flashing lights painting the scene in a chaotic, disorienting strobe. Flames engulfed the storage shed, licking at the wooden walls. Devouring years of Henri's hard work, decades of meticulously aged wine. Smoke billowed into the night, acrid and choking, carrying the scent of burning wood and scorched grapes. Izzy leaped out of the car, adrenaline surging through her veins, propelling her towards the inferno. But a burly firefighter, his face grimed with soot, blocked her path, his arm outstretched. "You can't go any closer, ma'am," he shouted, his voice barely audible over the roar of the flames and the hiss of water hoses. "We've got it under control." Izzy could barely hear him, the rush of her own blood pounding in her ears drowning out all other sounds. Elise stood beside her, shaking uncontrollably. Her eyes fixed on the conflagration, her face a mask of numb disbelief. "Who would do this?" she whispered, her voice barely audible above the crackling flames. Izzy already knew. And she wasn't the only one. The fire marshal arrived the next morning, his face etched with grim professionalism. "We found traces of accelerant," he stated, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "This was intentional. Arson." An arson investigation was opened. And sure enough, security footage from the winery confirmed their darkest suspicions. A hooded figure, cloaked in shadows, had been seen lurking around the back of the storage shed earlier that night, carrying a gasoline canister. The footage was grainy, indistinct, not clear enough to definitively identify a face. But Izzy, and Elise, and everyone who knew Jean-Luc Moreau, knew without a shadow of a doubt who the hooded figure was. Jean-Luc had returned. For revenge. Izzy found him 2 days later, holed up in a dingy bar just outside of town. A place that reeked of stale beer and desperation. He looked rough, unshaven, eyes bloodshot and shadowed with dark circles, as if he hadn't slept in days. Maybe he thought he had gotten away with it. Maybe he thought he was clever. Izzy didn't even hesitate. She walked straight up to him, her footsteps echoing in the near-empty bar, and dropped a flash drive onto the sticky, beer-stained table in front of him. "Security footage," she said, her voice cold and hard, devoid of any trace of sisterly affection. He glanced at the flash drive, then up at her, his eyes narrowing, attempting a pathetic charade of innocence. "What's this?" he scoffed, his voice slurred, reeking of alcohol. "You think you've got something on me?" But there was a flicker of panic in his eyes, a telltale twitch that betrayed his carefully constructed facade of indifference. You tell me, Jean-Luc, Izzy retorted, leaning in, lowering her voice to a dangerous whisper. The fire marshal is all over this. Insurance investigators are involved. Cops are involved. It's only a matter of time before they match that footage to you. He didn't say anything, his bravado crumbling under the weight of her unwavering gaze. Grandfather gave you exactly what you deserved, Izzy continued. Her voice laced with contempt. But instead of moving on, instead of even attempting to learn from your mistakes, you decided to burn the only thing left of him. You're pathetic. His jaw clenched, his knuckles whitening as he gripped his glass. What do you want, Isabelle? He spat, his voice laced with venom. Izzy smiled, a cold, mirthless smile that didn't reach her eyes. You're going to turn yourself in? He let out a bitter, humorless laugh. And if I don't? Izzy shrugged, her eyes unwavering. Then you'll be arrested in about 48 hours. Arson, insurance fraud, destruction of property. Take your pick. For the first time, real, palpable fear crept into his bleary eyes. He knew she wasn't bluffing. He knew she meant every word. And in that moment, Izzy saw it. That flicker of realization, that dawning understanding that he had finally, irrevocably, lost. Completely. Jean-Luc turned himself in the next morning. The evidence, though circumstantial, was damning. And he knew it. He was charged with arson, attempted insurance fraud, and destruction of property. The last time Izzy saw him, he was in handcuffs. Being led out of the courthouse, his face pale and defeated, the swagger completely gone. As he passed her, Izzy couldn't resist one final, parting shot. Enjoy your mother vine, Jean-Luc, she said. Her voice low but clear, laced with a chilling satisfaction. He didn't look back. And just like that, he was gone. Jean-Luc Moreau, the prodigal son, the entitled heir, the arsonist brother, had finally been taken down. Or so Izzy thought. After Jean-Luc's arrest, a collective sigh of relief swept through the Moreau family. The winery storage shed had been badly damaged, but not completely destroyed. And thanks to grandfather's meticulous insurance policies, they were able to begin the arduous process of rebuilding. Jean-Luc was facing years in prison, a fitting consequence for his destructive rage. They all assumed, with a weary optimism, that this was the end of it. The final, bitter chapter closed. They were wrong. A few weeks after Jean-Luc's arrest, Izzy received a call from Mr. Davies, the family lawyer. His voice was unusually strained, devoid of his usual calm professionalism. Isabelle, he said, his tone urgent, we need to meet. There's something you need to see. Izzy drove over to his office, her mind racing, assuming it was just more tedious paperwork to finalize grandfather's estate. But when she walked into his wood-paneled office, the air thick with the scent of old paper and legal anxieties, Mr. Davies had a thick stack of documents spread across his mahogany desk. His expression was grave, his usual affable demeanor replaced by a somber seriousness. Your grandfather, he began, his voice low and measured, had a lot of assets, Isabelle. But he also had something else. Something none of you knew about. He slid the stack of documents across the desk towards her. Izzy picked them up, her fingers trembling slightly, and began to read. As the words swam before her eyes, her blood ran cold. Grandfather, the pillar of financial prudence, the shrewd businessman. The man who had built Moreau Vineyards from nothing, had taken out a massive loan. Nearly a decade ago. And not just any loan. One from very dangerous people. The kind of people you didn't borrow money from unless you had absolutely no other choice. What the hell is this? Izzy asked, her voice barely a whisper. Her eyes wide with shock and dawning horror. Mr. Davies sighed, running a weary hand over his thinning gray hair. Your grandfather borrowed money to keep the vineyard afloat during the recession, Isabelle. The economic downturn hit Napa Valley hard. He did what he had to do to survive. He paid most of it back. But not all of it. Izzy flipped through the documents, her stomach twisting into a knot of dread. There it was, stark and undeniable, in black and white. A substantial sum still outstanding. And now, with grandfather gone, the debt had transferred to them. To her. As the primary heir. What happens if we don't pay? Izzy asked, her voice trembling. Though she already knew the answer. The lawyer hesitated. His gaze shifting away from hers. These aren't conventional lenders, Isabelle. They don't operate through legal channels. They have their own methods of collection. Izzy felt sick, a wave of nausea washing over her. Just when she thought they had weathered the storm. Just when she thought they had finally emerged from the darkness. Another, even more menacing battle was looming. 2 nights later, Izzy found out exactly how serious this was. She had just returned home. The evening air still clinging to the lingering scent of smoke from the winery fire. When she noticed a black car idling at the end of the long driveway. It wasn't a neighbor's car. It wasn't anyone she recognized. A chill snaked down her spine. She hurried inside, fumbling with the keys, trying to shake off the growing sense of unease. But before she could even lock the door, there was a knock. Slow. Deliberate. Ominous. Against her better judgment, she opened it. 2 men stood there. Silhouetted against the porch light, their presence radiating an aura of menace. That sent shivers down her spine. One was tall and lean, dressed in a sharp, dark suit, his expression calm, almost serene, but his eyes held a chilling emptiness. The other was built like a brick wall, his arms crossed, his face a mask of impassivity. Utterly silent, radiating a silent threat that spoke volumes. The suited man smiled, but there was no warmth in it, only a predatory glint. You must be Isabelle Moreau, he said, his voice smooth, like polished steel. Izzy didn't answer, her throat suddenly dry. He took a slow, deliberate step forward, closing the distance between them. Your grandfather, he continued, his voice dropping to a low, menacing purr. Owed us. Now it's your turn to make good on that debt. Izzy's heart pounded against her ribs. But she forced herself to maintain a semblance of composure. Grandfather is gone. She said, her voice trembling slightly, but still firm. That debt should have died with him. The man chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. That's not how it works, Miss Moreau. He reached into his impeccably tailored coat and pulled out a slip of paper, handing it to her. Izzy took it, her fingers numb. A number was written on it, stark and unforgiving. It was double what was stated in the loan documents Mr. Davies had shown her. That's not the original amount, she said, her voice barely audible. Interest, he replied smoothly, his smile widening. Revealing teeth that looked sharp and predatory. We were generous with your grandfather. We let him slide a few times. But now. He paused, his gaze hardening, the generosity is over. Izzy swallowed hard, the metallic taste of fear coating her tongue. And if I don't pay, she asked, the question hanging heavy in the air. His smile widened further, a chilling display of teeth. Then, he said. His voice dropping to a whisper that was somehow more terrifying than a shout. We start collecting. One way or another. He gestured subtly behind him. Towards the idling black car. Another man sat in the driver's seat. His face obscured by the shadows, but his presence radiating an unspoken threat. This wasn't just a morning visit. It was a message. Crystal clear. Izzy was out of her depth. Way out of her depth. And she knew it. Desperate, cornered, Izzy knew she needed help. And as much as the thought curdled in her stomach, as much as she loathed the idea. There was only one person who might possess information, however tainted, that could possibly save them. Jean-Luc. It took some maneuvering, some desperate phone calls and pleading. With a sympathetic prison guard, but Izzy managed to arrange a visit. To the county jail where Jean-Luc was being held, awaiting trial. The stark, sterile visiting room, with its thick plexiglass partition and echoing acoustics, felt like a descent into purgatory. When Jean-Luc was led in, his orange jumpsuit a stark contrast to his usual tailored suits. A smirk twisted his lips. Well, he drawled, leaning back in his chair, his eyes glinting with a perverse amusement. Didn't think I'd see you so soon. Little sister. What happened? Miss me? Izzy didn't have time for his games, for his childish taunts. She cut to the chase, her voice sharp and urgent. Grandfather owed money, Jean-Luc, she said bluntly. To some dangerous people. And now they're coming after us. The smirk faltered, the amusement fading from his eyes, replaced by a flicker of something unreadable, something akin to fear. Izzy leaned forward, her gaze unwavering, boring into him through the plexiglass. You were always sniffing around grandfather's finances, Jean-Luc. You must have known something about this. Jean-Luc rubbed his face, his bravado momentarily crumbling, revealing the weariness beneath. Yeah, he muttered, his voice low, almost grudging. I knew. Izzy's jaw clenched, her anger simmering just beneath the surface. And you didn't say anything, she accused, her voice rising. He shrugged, a gesture of callous indifference. What was I going to do, Isabelle? He didn't want help. Said he had it handled. Izzy slammed her fist on the cold metal table, the sharp bang echoing in the sterile room. Well, he didn't have it handled, Jean-Luc. And now they're expecting me to pay double what he owed. I need to know who we're dealing with. Jean-Luc sighed, a long, weary exhalation. They call themselves the Serpent Hand? He muttered, leaning in closer, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial whisper. They're old school, Isabelle. Loan sharks. And they don't forgive debts. He paused, his eyes narrowing, a flicker of something calculating returning to his gaze. Unless. Izzy's eyes narrowed, her heart pounding. Unless what, Jean-Luc, she pressed, her voice barely audible, hanging on his every word. Jean-Luc hesitated, then leaned in even closer, his voice dropping to a sibilant whisper, barely audible through the plexiglass. Unless, he hissed, you give them something bigger than what they're owed. Izzy left the jail with her head swimming, a chaotic mix of fear and a sliver of desperate hope churning in her stomach. If Jean-Luc was telling the truth, if there was a way out of this nightmare that didn't involve financial ruin, she had to find it. Paying them off was clearly not an option. Not with the exorbitant, inflated sum they were demanding. But what else could she possibly offer? The serpent hand that would be bigger than what they were owed? And then, like a lightning bolt, it hit her. Jean-Luc. That night, fueled by adrenaline and a desperate gamble, Izzy made a call. She set up a meeting. 2 days later, she found herself sitting across from the suited man again, this time in a quiet, out-of-the-way diner. The clatter of cutlery and hushed conversations a stark contrast to the storm raging inside her. You have my money, he asked, his voice flat, devoid of any pretense of civility. His cold eyes boring into hers as he sipped his lukewarm coffee. Izzy took a deep breath, forcing herself to meet his gaze, her hand steady despite the tremor that threatened to betray her inner turmoil. I have something better, she said, her voice clear and unwavering. His eyebrows raised slightly, a flicker of curiosity, or perhaps amusement, crossing his impassive face. Better, he echoed, skepticism dripping from the word. I know where you can find someone who's been stealing from you, Izzy stated, her voice firm, her heart hammering against her ribs. He set his coffee cup down on the table with a soft thud, his gaze sharpening, focusing on her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. Go on, he prompted, his voice low, dangerous. Izzy took another deep breath, steeling her nerves. My brother, Jean-Luc Moreau. She began, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. He's been dipping into side businesses. Not just grandfather's money. Yours too. His face remained unreadable, a mask of cold composure. But Izzy saw it. That subtle flicker of interest, that almost imperceptible tightening around his eyes. He was listening. He's in county jail right now, Izzy continued, pressing her advantage. Arson. Attempted insurance fraud. But that's just the tip of the iceberg. If you check your books, she pressed on, her voice gaining confidence. I guarantee you'll find missing cash. Jean-Luc's been skimming for years. Small amounts. Here and there. Enough to fund his lifestyle. He thought he was clever. He thought he was getting away with it. Silence stretched between them, thick and heavy. Punctuated only by the clatter of dishes from the kitchen. The man's gaze remained fixed on her, unwavering, assessing, calculating. Izzy held her breath, waiting, her fate hanging precariously in the balance. Then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, the corners of his mouth curved upwards. A smile. Not a warm smile, not a friendly smile. But a smile nonetheless. A smile that sent a shiver of dread. And a strange sense of grim satisfaction down Izzy's spine. I'll look into it, Miss Moreau, he said, his voice low, his eyes glinting with a predatory gleam. And just like that, Izzy knew. She had done it. She had gambled. And she had won. She had done something even grandfather, in all his shrewd business dealings, had never dared to do. She had turned the game on Jean-Luc. A week later, Jean-Luc disappeared from county jail. No trial. No sentencing. Just gone. Officially, they said he had been transferred to another facility. But Izzy, and everyone else who knew the truth, knew better. The serpent hand had collected their payment. In full. And as for Izzy, Moreau Vineyards was safe. The family home was safe. Elise was safe. And grandfather's legacy, though scarred and battered, lived on. Without Jean-Luc. Some debts, Izzy realized, aren't paid with money. Some debts are paid with justice. And Jean-Luc, in his own twisted way, had finally paid for his sins. The serpent hand had taken him, swallowed him whole, and just like that, he vanished. No trial, no sentencing, no second chances. The brother who had tormented their family for years, who had stolen, burned, and betrayed, was erased from the world as if he had never existed. For the first time in a long time, Izzy felt a fragile sense of peace settle over her. But she wasn't done yet. Jean-Luc had left a mess in his wake, a tangled web of debts, burned bridges, and unfinished business. And Izzy was determined to untangle every last thread of his damage. First, she made sure Elise was truly safe. With Jean-Luc gone, the constant undercurrent of threat, the ever-present fear, finally dissipated. Elise could breathe again, the tension slowly easing from her shoulders. The light returning to her eyes. No more cryptic phone calls. No more menacing shadows lurking in the vineyards, no more fear. Next, Izzy focused on revitalizing Moreau Vineyards. The insurance money from the fire, coupled with grandfather's hidden cash, allowed them to rebuild the storage shed. And more. Within a few months, the winery was not just back on its feet, but thriving. Stronger and more resilient than before. Izzy kept grandfather's name emblazoned on the winery sign, a constant reminder of the man who had built it all. Ensuring his legacy lived on, not just in the vines, but in the very soul of the vineyard. But there was one final loose end to tie up. That old, gnarled mother vine in Block 7. The sole inheritance grandfather had bequeathed to Jean-Luc. The thing he had laughed at, dismissed, thrown aside in his childish tantrum. The thing he had utterly ignored. Izzy had it, inspected Block 7 and the area around the mother vine. And that's when she discovered something. Something Jean-Luc, in his blind, grasping greed, had never bothered to check. Hidden deep beneath the mother vine, buried amongst its ancient roots, was a metal box. It was locked, but the key was still taped to a sturdy branch. of the mother vine, exactly where grandfather, in his meticulous, old-fashioned way, would have placed it. Izzy opened the box, her heart pounding with anticipation. Inside, nestled amongst faded velvet lining, were stacks of cash. Stacks of neatly bundled bills, old, but well-preserved, crisp and clean. And sitting on top of the money, a single, folded letter. Addressed simply, to whoever finds this. Izzy unfolded the letter, her fingers trembling, and began to read. Grandfather's familiar handwriting leaping off the page. To whoever finds this. If you're reading this, it means Jean-Luc never deserved this old vine. Inside you'll find enough money to keep Moreau Vineyards alive. To take care of your mother, to protect what I built. I had a feeling Jean-Luc would never bother looking. Greedy men never search for what they think has no value. Use it wisely. And don't waste a second feeling bad for him. Grandfather. Izzy sat there, stunned, rereading the letter again and again, trying to process the sheer poetic justice of it all. All this time, Jean-Luc had been sitting on a fortune. He had thrown the will aside in a fit of rage. Without even bothering to inspect the mother vine. He had burned down the winery storage shed, tried to defraud the insurance company. And ultimately ruined his own life, all while his real inheritance, his chance at redemption, sat right under his nose, rooted in Block 7. Izzy used the money exactly as grandfather had instructed. She expanded the winery, making it bigger, better, and more sustainable than ever before. She ensured Elise would never have to worry about finances again, securing her future. Her peace of mind. She even set aside a portion for her younger cousins, ensuring the next generation of Moreaus would have a solid foundation. Wouldn't have to struggle the way grandfather had. And as for the mother vine? Izzy restored its glory, ensuring its health and longevity. A symbol of the vineyard's enduring strength. It stood proudly in Block 7. Reaching towards the Napa Valley sun, a shining reminder of the man who had truly built this family, this legacy. A testament to hard work, resilience, and a justice that, in the end, was both brutal and beautiful. And as for Jean-Luc, his name was never spoken again at Moreau Vineyards. No grave, no legacy, no memory. Just a ghost, a cautionary tale whispered on the wind. A man who thought he could steal everything, only to end up with nothing. And to Izzy, that, in its own quiet way, was the best revenge of all.